now for David. John, I think, has been here since he was in short trousers, so he's been around a while, nonetheless. Yeah. So, good afternoon, gentlemen. How are you doing?
Good afternoon.
Afternoon, Gary.
Nice to be with you, Gary. Nice to be talking to some of your great members who in themselves are doing a great job, I'm sure, with their clients, trying to keep them surviving in what is a very difficult time for SMEs.
Yeah, I think they've certainly been going the extra mile. A lot of their clients have panicked. Our members, as always, basically haven't. I mean, these are the same people that dealt with the Millennium Bug, RTI, auto-enrollment, digital tax and everything else. The whole world was going to stop, but it didn't. They've just sort of knuckled down and got on with it. They're a pretty stoic bunch of people. And yeah, you know, we get very few people jumping up and down and wanting to throw in the towel, thankfully. So yeah, we're hearing about it. So John, you've been with Genesis a long time. Give us a few bits of info about what Genesis is all about. What makes it tick?
As you'll know, Gary, because you're that same age, we started this some 20 years ago, and we started it when basically the Blair government came in. Some of you might remember that guy. What we wanted to do was to have a small business organization that was cross-party, i.e. it wasn't politically allied to Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrat or whatever. And the idea of that was we wanted to ensure that whatever we were saying would be adopted by whichever government happened to be in power at a particular time. So it's a bit like a constitution in some ways for small business. And in fact, we put up on a number of occasions a charter for small businesses.
I know that, yeah.
Which everybody would sort of tie into. And what we did is we got together academics, business people like yourself, organizations effectively, and said, look, you can lobby for yourselves, but at times it's not a bad thing to share the lobbying. You've got similar problems with other organizations. Why not bring all that together? And the difference for our lobbying was that we brought in parliamentarians, i.e. people in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Because we had known a lot of them anyway, we decided that we tap them on the shoulder and say, look, Mr. MP or Mrs. MP or Baron or Baroness, you ought to be looking at this for small business. Put it into your government policy, put it into your opposition policy, but be prepared to, you know, talk on these things. So we was really improving the quality of the debate is what we put as our catchphrase. And over a period of time, we've got something like, you know, 115 trade associations representing over 1 million businesses. And, you know, hopefully we lobby with more authority than we would if those individual businesses were doing their own thing or even in a small collective. So we used to get very involved in Parliament until the lockdown. And that was a difference that we used to hold our meetings in Parliament. We would have breakfast where members of the different trade associations would come along. There would be a Senate meeting afterwards where we would talk policy, the things which affected those institutions and what we were planning to do. We bring in guest speakers as well. And so that was all part of this improving the quality of the debate. And a couple of years ago, David Harvey came back on board because he was with us in the early days, went off to make his fortune elsewhere, but then came back. And we've been really doing research into those key areas that businesses want. And we can perhaps talk about some of them later on, things like, you know, late payment and golden red tape and all that sort of gilding the lily as things go on. So, you know, we are very much the same as we were when we started. We've still got an awful lot of contacts in Parliament, which makes us different to most of the other lobbying organizations.
Yeah. So when I first got to know you, you were a bit like the Morecambe and Wise show. You were very much the Wise. The Morecambe guy, the one that got into all the trouble and the corners and everything else, was a lovely man called Alan Cleverley, who unfortunately is no longer with us. Yeah. Although our members will remember from our Luca Awards that each year now we have, in his honour, been giving away the Alan Cleverly Luca for Small Business Champion. In fact, you very kindly came and presented that on its first year, which was very good.
I did. And Alan's now been dead 3 years, but it was his idea to do this cross-party thing. And in fact, under his tutelage in the early days, we actually formed the largest all-party group in Parliament, bar the Real Ale party group, which apparently everybody belonged to because they got free beer at Christmas. So he was very influential in us starting this and getting it to where it is today. And we miss him. We miss him dearly.
Well, we all do, yeah. You know, and yeah, it's a strange one because he was great fun and certainly nice to have known him. Of course, stepping into those ever so large shoes, no pressure here, is David, who is slightly different character, I would suggest, but nonetheless, David, what have you brought to the table?
So, Gary, I could never bring what Alan brought because he was a larger than life. Those of you who've read Charles Dickens might remember The Ghost of Christmas Past in Scrooge, and that was Alan. You know, a very happy, big, but also somebody who really brought people together and made them think about the good things in life. Yeah. And so he brought a lot of people in. My background is I'm an odd combination of chartered accountant and public affairs practitioner. I've done big public affairs and trade association jobs around the world, but I wanted to do something to support the small business community. I've been involved with Genesis at the beginning, and because I have a portfolio of things, it was a good thing to do to put a lot of time towards Genesis to go with that, so we could support that that small business community. And I think one of the drivers for me is that coming back to much more of a UK focus after nearly 20 years, the agenda had not really moved on. Small firms still found it very difficult to raise money. They were still not treated very well by many of the banks. They weren't getting the skilled people they needed. There was too much regulation and red tape. And often late payment was a burden. So it made me think we have to do something more about it. And John, of course, have been working on that, and there have been progress. Some of the finance schemes from government, particularly to support trade, have been very much coming from Genesis. And I think part of that, one of the attractions to me, Genesis does not shout. We ring the right people, we put papers to them, we do very good research that stands up to academic tests, so the civil servants will respect it, and you have to do that. And that means that we can ask questions, we can say things behind closed doors that perhaps other people can't always say. And even if we're not thought to be right, we're respected enough to be listened to. And so that's what we're trying to bring to persuade.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, so I'm talking to my average member who's out in, I don't know, Northumberland or something like this, you know, and they're busy looking after their 30 or 40 clients. Why does politics matter to them? What is it that you think politics can do that they can have some form of say in that isn't just going to be snowballed because they're one of a large number of smaller entities that basically always presume they never get listened to? Is that your place?
That very much is. And for much of my life, when I've seen small business people, they've been right to feel entirely like that. And up to the early 80s, research shows that's how small business was regarded. You either got bigger or you were seen as a failure by opinion makers and politicians. That has changed to quite a large extent, but it hasn't changed enough. So, I mean, I'll take an example where I think people rightly get very annoyed, and that's the banking scandals. We all saw what happened at Reading, where people's businesses were in trouble, were lured in to borrow more money, and the objectives of bankers who were being condemned and sent to prison and condemned by their own banks was actually personal advancement. And that leaves a real stain on the finance community that's supposed to supporting small businesses. It also undermines confidence. Another aspect of that, I think that we worked very hard on, we've had some progress, is late payment. Now, if you've got a bookkeeper, the chances are you don't have so many late payment problems because the personal relationship between a small client and a bookkeeper means you probably keep on top of it if you don't pay, and the bookkeeper probably knows what to say, what nice words and what threatening words to say to a non-paying business that is not paying your client. But the office of the late payment office, the Small Business Commissioner, we've contributed quite a bit to how it should be toughened up. So you've now got a real power of report, but also the government's agreed that office should have the power to prosecute, as well as naming and shaming. So really big companies can be taken to task and then go all over the press, and we can press them to go further. Unfair contract is a major problem. Now, one of your members may come across a client who's got stuck in a really unpleasant contract with a big business, and the contract might say that big business can change the contract terms pretty much as it likes. And if your expertise is, let's say that you're an expert on designing kitchens, and that's what you do. You're not going to be a financial expert, and you bring this problem to your bookkeeper. Sometimes it may be too late. We want to see mechanisms to make it very possible for an expert advisor to get stuck in and get matters taken to tribunal. This happens in France, and those contracts can be struck out. So it's step after step to make things better. And the ideal world to me is when your member in Northumberland never has to think about government, because business is easy, things get done, and the law works. Well, fancy island, isn't it?
Garry? Yeah, obviously, yeah. Yeah, that's great. I mentioned Northumberland there because I wanted to avoid certain areas that people are in and don't. That's it, yeah. Obviously, there is a big talk at the moment about trying to get the northern powerhouse going, etc. I mean, I can remember this when I was a kid, being taken up to Liverpool and told it's got to be all brighter and better up here one day. It obviously is. That just happened to be just up the road from where I was living at the time. How are we going to get anywhere north of Watford to come out of the sort of problems we're in at the moment? I mean, is this the ideal opportunity now for us to work with government to actually do a bit of a levelling, or what?
Well, I think the first thing they're doing, of course, is saying infrastructure. And infrastructure, I mean broadband in particular, which I regard as we're one of the worst countries for it. Everybody
certainly in London. Certainly bad in London.
I tell you, you're trying to work from home, and you're competing with the kids next door doing their homework. People watching Netflix all day, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's very difficult. And around the country, certain parts of the country, you can't get decent broadband at all. So how can you encourage companies in rural areas, particularly say up north or whatever, to be able to do business from home and to start small businesses? Not enough broadband. So infrastructure is a key to that. And the government say that they are going to do something about it, but we have heard that before. Funnily enough, the minister's in charge of that. Now one of them is in charge of the National Health Service. That's interesting, isn't it?
I remember that. Yeah, absolutely.
You remember that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So HS2 is another thing which comes in. Now, love it or hate it, it will create jobs. It will improve the rail links. Bearing in mind, and if you remember, Garry, you might have been there when we had the guy from the government NGO that was dealing with infrastructure, who said that the Victorian railway lines are falling apart.
Yeah,
and they do need to be not just reinforced, patched as they have been for the last 100 years. They actually need to be replaced. And so, there's an awful lot of that sort of stuff going on. So infrastructure is key, and the government have put our money where their mouth is, and basically said, we're going to have infrastructure, we're going to have better rail, road as well, better road links, and better broadband. That actually then should make the country much more even in terms of what it's got to offer in terms of facilities to run your businesses. So that is sort of got to be key. So that's my first bit. David, you want to come in?
Yeah, I think there's a second aspect. It's about making matters more autonomous. Local people should take local decisions. So over the last 3 or 4 years, we've had this experiment with local mayors. And irrespective of political parties, they've been good or they've been bad. But I point to Labour's Andy Burnham in Manchester and Andy Street for the Tories in Birmingham. Both have done really good local decision making, they reinforced local economies, and they've got local people involved. And there's a good example through the COVID pandemic. One of the reasons Germans have done better is a much more devolved economy, and power sits in about 20 different places rather than just in one place. It's not all in Berlin. And they've been able to fit policy for the area. So that means adaptations that reflect the population, its demographic, how things have developed with the disease. And I think we could do much better with greater devolution away from London. I'm a Londoner born and bred. I love London, but I'll be the first to admit that in some ways we get too much attention, and perhaps sometimes in areas like education, training, particularly, too much of the cake. And I'll point to one particular example, and that's college education type education, not university, but the skills that many small towns need to run shops, small businesses, really good practical skills. Well, the tendency has been to centralise in London, also to an extent in Bristol or Birmingham and Newcastle, and to take that sort of education away from towns of 50, 60,000 people when they really need it. And it's been really short-sighted.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, obviously we see some huge changes taking place at the moment in education. I mean, next year, I think the years of just about coping now with vocational qualifications, they're all going to be squashed because they're now going to be called technical qualifications or TQuals. Yeah. They're talking about all sorts of changes. And, it's one of my soapboxes that unfortunately too much education is based on how much funding the colleges need rather than how much education the students need. But we'll probably leave that one for another day. You mentioned before about contracts and people being pushed by larger firms and all the rest of it. We haven't had a chance to find back from our members yet, but we have around 600 of our bookkeepers who deal predominantly with the agricultural sector. Now, you and I both know, and we've had lots of people coming into Genesis over the years while I was there, that farmers get pushed into a corner. Their factory is actually the field, except that their field sometimes gets bleached with the sun or other times get washed out. But people don't seem to necessarily feel any empathy for a farmer. They always think they're full of money and, they're living out there in this wonderful land, etc. But one of the big problems, of course, was their contracts, where they were being paid 90 days behind provision of product by the big supermarkets. Have you heard whether that sort of thing has been pulled in now that the British farmers are more necessary to British business, or have you heard anything?
Not yet. And I guess that we'd certainly pressure for it, and so would most Genesis organisations. And we find a lot of commonality across the sectors on this one. 90 days can be a killer. And some of the big businesses that are after that they're getting a cash flow of perhaps 10 or 20 days. If you look at Scandinavia, particularly Finland's a good example, on the whole, people tend to pay each other in 5 to 10 days. Part of it is cultural. They're very different, they're a bit more regimented than we are, but it's also what's expected, and it's what you do. And our feelings, you've got to start by saying to the big businesses, you're going to start first, you're going to start paying in 10 days. And of course, if you can't, because you're in trouble, you can tell us and we'll give you a bit of an exemption, but you start to get good practices. Now, one of the big supermarkets, I won't say which one, decided to appoint someone who's in charge of external relationships, who said, right, we're going to pay everyone within 5 to 10 days. And lo and behold, they got the best suppliers. They saw the sales go up. They saw lots of other good things happening. So I think there's a moral in that.
Yeah. I think the other thing to add on that is, I personally think it should have been a condition of the bailout of bigger companies, and there have been a lot that we don't even know about, is that they actually pay at least within the terms of trade that they've got. And my worry is that they'll do like they normally do, take all this money off the government and still take longer to pay their suppliers. It'll be, just in time again when they need something. So we do have to change the culture. So that's one thing that we've been pushing for, again, only this week. David, you might like to come in about that. We put a paper out to the world on this.
So we've done 2 relevant bits of work over the last few weeks, and a few of my colleagues have been burning the midnight oil. The first of which is just simply pointing out to, and we've got hopefully a senior parliamentarian speaking about this in a couple of weeks' time when Parliament sits a bit more often, just pointing out the sheer damage that is done by late payment, the number of businesses that go under. And in some sectors, it is the normal thing to have 30 days beyond contract terms outstanding. It's what the bigger people do. But it's also the issues such as you only actually get paid when your invoice is signed off as being perfect. So they'll look at one item in a consignment and say, oh, that might be faulty, we'll send it back for checking. So suddenly you find it takes an awfully long time for your invoice to be validated. And of course, it only becomes late 30 days after validation. So all sorts of practices that we describe as dubious. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't outstanding people there. Of the supermarkets, I've got Waitrose come out pretty well. Among the football clubs, I think there's Chelsea come out very well as people who pay very much on time. But there are others at the other end of the line who don't do as well. I think my own club, Arsenal, is somewhere in the middle. Could do better, could do worse. So government do need to pick up, and Johnny's right, it needs to be part of the terms of getting help. The second thing that we thought might be useful, and perhaps I'll pass back to John in a moment on this one, is people need some short-term liquidity, which is not just going to be the bank charging you a lot more money. We have, for instance, we have trade associations in various areas around things about small items of food or gifts sold at markets or sent to you in the post, something you might buy. And they're quite small businesses as part of a union. And they're going to need just a few £1,000s of working capital. It's not too expensive. And we've been looking at a government credit card. John, let me pass back to you so we share it out a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, what we've got is, and Garry, you'll know, we have somebody that is steeped in the payments system, who's in our ranks, and he's been working very closely with the Visas and the MasterCards of this world, because that's his area, obviously with the challenger banks as well. But we've come up with a scheme whereby we produce a sort of Genesis business card over and above the facilities that an individual SME might already have with their bank and so on. You know, the problem with the bank is, some money comes in from somebody, it might be late, they suddenly decide that they're going to reduce your overdraft or not, all the tricks that they get up to, because they're very short-termist. We're saying that you could have a Genesis business credit card, probably up to 10,000, and you would not have to pay that back within the normal usurious rates that credit cards are paid on. And the terms would be, it could be 6 months or more before you have to pay any of it back. So we're trying to give our members, their organizations, the first dips, if you like, into this Genesis credit card backed by government, because ultimately government would pick up any faults on it. But the technology now is such that the approvals for this could be very, very quick indeed. I think you will have seen, for example, amongst your own members there, Garry, a lot of them have probably become limited companies now, rather than sole traders. Of course, that makes it a lot easier to get credit and to be checked out. And that would be the case for this particular business credit card, because you'd have to be a limited company or an LLP effectively to be considered for it. But this could add up to 5 billion additionally into the cash flow of SMEs, and it would be perpetual, and it would lead on hopefully to what we've also been calling for, is some sort of sovereign wealth fund for small businesses, whereby the government backing would allow money to be put into businesses, ultimately as loan or even as equity which we bought back at some stage, really to get the SME going, because we are half the economy. We're about 2.5 trillion, I think, in terms of turnover in the SME sector. We're half the economy, as I said. So it's important to effectively we try and find some short-term, as David was saying earlier, ways of helping the cash flow of businesses, which probably for a lot of people is running out today, as Garry was mentioning to us early. So that's an interesting thing that we're doing, which should be available to Genesis members and their clients.
So this is going to be something a bit like the help to buy scheme almost. The government takes a chunk, you take a chunk, and you get the chance to buy back there a bit later or something or other.
Yeah, it's actually no good idea is entirely original. So we've borrowed ideas from the States, from their Small Business Administration, and also from the German bank, the KWF, which supports small businesses. And it might be you get the money for 20 years in some of the States examples. The conditions they tie in there are a bit of mentoring and training. They operate through a couple of the commercial banks, but it's very much on the terms of supporting small business. It all started with President Eisenhower after the war with really wanting to rebuild. And surprisingly, this quite generous and supportive fund in the States It's only ever lost money in a couple of really difficult years like 2008. On the whole, it's made money for the US economy and businesses have been generated. And the same in Germany. It's that really long-term view. We're not looking for a profit today. We hope to come out with everyone winning on a 10 to 15-year basis.
Well, the difference is, Garry, of course, this is owned really by the taxpayer at the end of the day.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, how do you think the Small Business Bank is doing? I mean, this was set up to help small businesses. It seems to be going up and down a bit, you know. Is it winning? Is it doing us any good out there?
Oh dear, where shall I start?
Yeah.
Best of intentions, best of intentions.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that it was very difficult when they set it up to look at the really big picture of our culture about investing in small business. You can pick 2 or 3 areas in Europe, and I'm going to pick Northern Italy. I'll pick large bits of Germany, but there are also bits of France where they've taken a very long-term cultural approach to investment. And we haven't done that for a very long time. Now, one reason for that, as an example, is we were very successful at privatizing. We've had lots of very successful big businesses. But the leadership of the small business sector at the top end, the big small businesses, they all took their money and they ran. You know, they did very well. So it's been quite difficult for voices in the small business area to say, we want to have positive change. So you've got a culture driven by bits of the city, which is very short-termist, which is right for some markets, but not, I think, the SME market here. So we're trying to turn something round. And I think that the schemes that have been developed by the Small Business Bank have been okay for certain types of company, certain types of business, and it's often been at the medium-sized and bigger medium-sized end of the spectrum. And that's because of a real British obsession. We are, on the whole, quite bad at taking a small company and getting it on the growth corridor and making it to a big one. So our pyramid of businesses is really broad. There are lots of people who do pretty well as sole traders and smallest businesses, but growing is bigger, a bigger challenge. And that's something we need to try and correct. But we also got hung up about it. It's a very noble and good thing to be a sole trader, to make money, support your family, your interest, or even to say, because of this, I can work 3 days a week and play golf for the others. That's a good thing to do, and it supports our economy, and we need support for business right through. And the mandate of the Small Business Bank is a bit more bigger business, and it's a bit tied up with these preoccupations we have with getting bigger businesses supported rather than everybody else.
Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons that I got involved with Genesis originally was because we share a patron, a royal patron in Prince Michael of Kent, and I was invited to a dinner at which Genesis members were hosted by His Royal Highness. And then, as everybody subsequently to that has found out, once you go to one of Alan Cleverley's meetings, you don't come out without having signed a cheque or something. So hence, I've been there for a while. The attraction for us as an organisation was being able to sit around the table with parliamentarians, having not actually known anything much about how Parliament worked, and not claiming to know too much about it now either. But over the years, you had a succession of, as I think you alluded to before, a lot of MPs that you've been involved with. I mean, you mentioned Lord Risby. Lord Risby has very kindly hosted us for a couple of high table lunches or dinners at the House of Lords, so he's a useful contact. Brian Binley, of course, who was he was on the all-party parliamentary small business group. He was a director. He's no longer an MP now, is he? He's
no longer an MP, but he's still a member of Genesis. Yeah.
And Anne-Marie Morris, who of course was the all-party parliamentary micro business group, and we did a lot of work with her in those days. And she actually opened one of our conferences at, in the middle of London here. So you've had those people. What I find with politicians is, though, obviously they're jacks of all trades, and they seem to rely upon organisations like Genesis to give them information, because although they've always got, I found now, I go to meetings and you've got an MP in front of you and he's got 4 young people behind him who've just straight out of school, 2 of which have learnt to shave and 2 haven't. And they're feeding him constantly with little notes, but actually a lot of their information comes from lobby groups like yourself. So do you think that's going to continue in this new, well, whatever comes out of this lockdown government? Are they still going to require people like you to keep them on the level pathway?
Well, I think so. I mean, I have to declare my colours. I've been Michael Gove's chairman for too many years. I'm his deputy chairman political still. So, you know, as long as he's there, at worst, I would have some influence in the sense of getting things through to cabinet. David has a tremendous Rolodex, as I remember, of people in government as well. And being slightly younger, you know, it's another generation of people coming through. So I think we have them. We've got some great new members have come through too in the membership organisations, who've actually got some of their own contacts. And every time there is a new batch of MPs that comes in, we say, you know, do we know them? Do we know anybody who knows them? And we try to get them involved. And it seems to work. And I think that the key, which I've seen over the years, is, you know, sort of every 5 years there's a churn, and we do pick up some new people. A few fall off their pegs at the far end, but by and large there are more coming now than we had in a little while. Brexit had something to do with that to start with, because, you know, a lot of people were trying to get more voice on Brexit, depending on which side you were fighting. But now I think we're seeing any information you can get to us about small business, you know, the 50% of the economy from a GDP point of view, the better. You know, people are crying out for it, where nobody's trying to sort of upstage them. You're trying to give them information, not make them look silly.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of information bandied about the sector. And I'm not sure a lot of it is based on anything other than 250 people asked on a Friday night what they think about the price of a pint or something or other. Yeah. I remember a few years back in Genesis, we used to be involved with NatWest when they did the annual review with the old professor there. I've forgotten his name now. Who was it? Anyway, and I think that sort of thing is something that would be very helpful, and certainly ICB would be keen to work with you on something like that again, because it needs to be a complete cross-party. You've got to get numbers though, because you know the 250 people that will easily answer a survey are not necessarily the grassroots who are so busy they think, oh, I can't be bothered to do a survey. And I think, if you remember, we did that big survey probably 5-6 years ago now with YouGov, and all of the organisations put forward their members, but I think ICB members accounted for about 50% of the input.
They did.
Engineering Federation under whoever it was, Saron, that was it, Saron. He was the other 50%, so it was a completely skewed survey, really. And I think we need to get that out, but we need to get our members to ask their clients, not come up with something off the top of their heads, and it is difficult. You know, some businesses don't want to know, but I think that I mean, looking at what most politicians are saying nowadays, whether or not you're left, right, middle, wherever the hell you are, it doesn't really matter. But there seemed to be prior to COVID a genuine desire to do something about sorting out a lot of the problems that we've got. And I'm presuming they're going to come back. So I think if we can get something sorted in due course, if we could work with you on something like that, or whoever it might be, I think we need a very large focus group. You know, we need to be asking 5,000, 10,000 businesses, not 250, as I say. So I think that will make a big difference, because government are sponges for information, aren't they?
They are.
Numbers, Gary, as well. So, I mean, one's caught in a bit of a dilemma. You're dealing with an MP, and you've described their staff accurately, you know, very young people just out of university. And that MP has got 800 issues landing on their desk every day. Tweets, emails, it's massively more than it was 30 or 40 years ago. And even if they're passionate about small business, getting the headspace is very difficult. And for them, you've got to hope to catch them with the first 2 paragraphs of the press release. Unless there's someone who's a bit like us, who's totally obsessed with the topic. On the other hand, if you go into Whitehall, and we took in a set of ideas about changes to the late payment regime, we've taken ideas too about simplified investment regimes for SMEs, and the civil servants will take you through every last reference. They'll really want to test you with a rigour that you might get in a doctoral examination at a university, which is a good thing. So you're always trying to do 2 things at once. And I think a good survey has got to do what you've said. It's got to really dig down. Then you've got to have the person with the silver pen who can just pull out those 3 nuggets, which will get the minister to say, yeah, there's something in this. And, you know, certainly with the top politicians that we deal with, it's giving them that dart. And even if they're really interested themselves, they've got to sit around a meeting table with people in their department or, say, a cabinet, and they've got to make an impression. And part of that, sadly, is the age we live in, the social media age, an age where a news cycle is ridiculously short. And it makes getting the right answer very complicated, and also not getting this herd instinct in one direction. The world of business is complicated. Every sector is different, and so different. And trying to avoid really simple knee-jerk answers can be a real challenge at times. We have to get them to think.
Well, I think your point is valid, though, Gary. I think, you know, the more of our membership that can get involved in our surveys, the better. So we're very happy to, you know, deal with you and your members on that. Remember, we do part of that with our Bank of England survey, which we do twice a year. I mean, that's very specific in terms of the KPIs, if you like, of individual businesses. But, you know, people do know that surveys come from us. So I think we could do something a bit more comprehensive. We'll take that on board with you.
We certainly shall.
Did you get any further with trying to regionalise Genesis? Because I know you regionalise this in as much as you've got a Finnish outpost and you've got various odd outposts like that. But I mean, at one stage, you're going to have something up in the north, you're going to have something in Scotland. I remember going over to the Welsh Parliament and then being very
what basically
keen to do something.
Gary, is we found a lot of people, you'll know the people probably from the north, who suddenly business took off to such an extent that they're now offshore.
Oh.
So you start again. But one thing which, you know, we decided on when David came back on board is that, look, we got to get our research papers out. We got to be listened to attract the right people, if you like, again, so that we can sort of build these centers of excellence right the way in the country. And we take our lead from our members like yourselves to say, you know, where you think is a good place to be. For example, you know, Manchester, David mentioned earlier, you know, Birmingham, where we know that the local support from the mayor's office and the various chambers and so on is there. You need to do something. But the problem you've actually got there, of course, is that you're not easily going to get members of parliament to go to meetings that you might be having in Manchester or Birmingham unless they were local MPs.
Yeah.
There's this attraction of London. A lot of our member organizations say, we all like to go to London. Now, that might change now, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, it might do. I mean, I must admit, our members, I mean, we do an annual conference and we do it in London.
It's good.
And we have a certain group of people saying, well, what about Manchester? What about Edinburgh? So you do a survey and everybody still wants London.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to get to, because we tend to get a slightly different profile of speaker. We normally get a politician of some size or description. And people like, whilst they're coming to their conference, to go for a shop. You know, so we are guided by our members as always. You know, we do what we're told is as much as
what we are doing, Garry, which may lead on to something like this, is that we are working with more universities, and you know, we're following, for example, universities on the HS2 route to ensure that we can find out what is happening in the localities as we pass through. So we're following the sort of the infrastructure type thing with the universities, with those professors who have interest in small business. So I think, you know, ultimately I can see, you know, much more sort of regional power base for us. It's certainly feeding in on information, if not having lots of meetings in those areas.
I think the other thing, Garry, is that you made a very wise point about the over-centralisation of the UK on London. I think all of us find working by Zoom and Teams off the time, it can be irritating, it can be very tiring, but it does actually mean that we can start to run, we're going to be starting to run a seminar programme you know, in the early summer, where actually someone won't need to get on a train and come to London, but we hopefully have a minister or a policy person or someone who's leading ideas in small business on the end of Zoom for a couple of hours to talk through what they're thinking and why they're thinking it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm looking at myself here now, just looking, I'm reminded that you had the National Hairdressers Federation as one of your members.
It's not
some
funny.
Organisations, I mean, I think we've been fortunate that our members have become a necessity in this, and they can carry on their job, mainly because not because of Zoom, but because we are cloud-based. The majority of what a bookkeeper does now is wrapped up in their telephone, their laptop, their iPad, or whatever, and that came about probably 2 to 3 years ago in the main. So nobody quite realised how essential it was going to become. It was helpful at the time. It's now a necessity. But some organisations have members that are pretty well at rock bottom at the moment. So what are we going to do? How are we going to get the people out of furlough and actually into a job when this is all done? Is that something that you're working on with your various political groups or your professional bodies?
We are.
We certainly know the problem. Go on, David, you go first.
So we've talked to a number of stakeholders, and the issue is that everyone, you're right, it's going to be extremely difficult. The IOD did some research on this, and people, let's be honest, people have not got a vast amount of confidence. It's one of the reasons for our credit card idea is to give someone the confidence to go out and buy some stock, to know they can do that, or to make that short marketing trip, which is going to be essential, or to make some things. So it needs that sort of push. It also needs, for businesses that are saying retail in town centres, local government needs to close streets, it needs to move traffic, it needs to do everything possible so people are going to be happy to come out and at a social distance to buy things. And that won't be quick. So I think that, first of all, government needs to be not very quick at ending some of the support schemes. They need businesses to ramp up slowly, and they need people to feel comfortable that they could work for a month or two at 30%, 50%, and gradually move forward. But there are areas where I can't give you easy answers. If you will have some of your members who are bookkeeping for restaurants or perhaps even for a small theatre, and that's going to be incredibly tough. It's very difficult. One of the things about sort of looking at business history is, if you've got any wisdom, it's never like the last time. You can learn to think, but you can't pretend things will be the same. So going back to thinking about the flu in the 1950s that did close some businesses, but there was a big epidemic around 1920. Some places did get quite badly damaged, and it just took some time for other people to grab opportunities. So if we find that we are eating out a lot less, as I'm afraid people will lose their firms. Equally, I've heard of a local pub which saw there was a loophole, and they've started selling alcohol in an orderly queue at their door. They were technically breaking a rule, and so they were politely asked to close, but they'll be back in a couple of weeks' time. It really is a matter of pushing hard and hoping. I think you're in the 70 or 80% will get through. There isn't a magic button to press for some sectors.
I think there's some real problems. I think, because the method we all work is changing as well. People aren't going to be back to the offices where they all mingle. It's not going to happen. They're going to be more working from home. And I think there will be millions without a job. It really is going to be very serious. And we don't have a magic wand to help them. We just have to raise it with the politicians to say, you've got to hold people's hand for longer. And we've got to give people hope. And this is why partly we came up with this idea of a Genesis credit card. Get businesses moving. Now, if that's really successful, as we think it would be, you could get another 50,000 businesses involved. It could be the way you start a business rather than, it just being for existing businesses.
But to give it a positive, because you never quite know. So we all know we haven't built enough homes, particularly for young people, over the last 30, 40 years.
No.
If we all decide we're going to work at home, let's say 3 days a week, first of all, it means that people who've got little places in Birmingham or London or Bristol might think, I safely could actually base myself in Cornwall or somewhere lovely near a nature reserve in East Anglia, and you start to free up space in town centres. I live in an area which is full of offices. There are lots of little cafes, places where people get lunches. Even if they reopen, there'll be nobody there half the time. So will property prices fall? Will it be easier for someone to have a sort of a a little place in London, but also to have their real life somewhere they really would like to live rather than being squashed into a big city. And I don't know, but I just wonder if the mega day of London may draw to a close a bit, and that the day of the medium-sized town where things are a bit more spacious and spaced out might actually start to come back. And it's things like this which change that sort of geography. The one thing I'm certain about is whatever I say I'm going to be wrong, it'll be something else. But things will change.
Yeah, I can see some changes. I mean, I think a lot of people will revert back to their clubbing and everything, and eating out and all the rest of it. Because I mean, nowadays apartments in London, as you know, the new stuff that's being built, you've got a very tiny kitchen at the top end of what is a very tiny lounge. You don't really want to start cooking there. The idea is you're going to go out in one of the downstairs piazzas or something or other. So yeah, I mean, yeah, that's it's all great and it's changing. I mean, the other big thing, of course, you did allude to it very, very briefly there. At the end of this year, we're coming out. Do you reckon that's still it'll just happen on the 1st of January or what?
Well, I certainly think it will. I think, next month we're going to hear probably whether we are going to be out or not, because they're going to have to make their minds up whether we made sufficient progress on an agreement to continue. So, I mean, I know that behind the scenes, there have been a lot of politicians and civil servants working on this. I think they're optimistic either way, in the sense that if they're further enough in, that's great. If they're not further enough in, that's also great, because we're definitely out. I mean, yes is the first best answer for most people, but no is the second best answer. So I think we're going to know in a few weeks whether really we are definitely going at the end of December. I think there'll be no extension. I mean, both the government and the opposition say there should be no extension.
Yeah, and I think probably by the sound of it, most countries in Europe have got more problems to worry about than whether little old England gets left behind or thrown out or whatever. But
Germany are worried, of course, of how much they're going to have to pay out to bail out, the rest of Europe.
Yeah. Now, one of the people that worked for both Genesis and ICB was the inimitable Dr. David Doyle, who was European through and through. He's gone a little bit quiet at the moment, but he was the go-between. But you're still going to presumably need to keep a foot in Europe because they're neighbours. They're just like any other country. Yeah?
Well, we're continuing, as you know. We're allowed to go into the EU, into the Parliament. We still continue to do that because, yes, we still believe that we can influence things because of what you said. There's going to be trade no matter what. We really ought to do an agreement with the EU because, it's on some people's book 50%, some people's book 37% of our trade. Why would we, give that up? A lot of SMEs do business in Europe, would want to continue to do business. It's daft that we don't stay somewhere in there. So we're certainly going to stay within the institution to find out what's going on and to lobby for it. And hopefully their restaurants will open if ours don't.
Yeah, I noticed on the lunchtime news that Nissan is closing its Barcelona plant. But it is staying in the UK and it's putting even more money into it. I think I got caught in a taxi just before lockdown, and it was a Nissan electric taxi. And I spent, I think, 40 minutes being completely filled with the benefits of a Nissan electric taxi over every other single taxi on the road. This man was completely sold on Nissan. So I think a lot of the confidence that people were trying to chip away at was false. I think, people will still invest here, which is good. And I know, talking to one of our members recently, although Nissan has nothing to do with them, they actually deal with 3 firms, I think it is, that work for Nissan. I think, one did security, one did painting and decorating, one, I think, serviced the vehicles, for the workers or something or other. So there's such a lot of business that is based on big business, which we think we've got nothing to do with. We've still got small businesses that are dealing with that, and it's good work for bookkeepers and obviously for the people who are doing that.
Yeah. And I mean, I think if we have that hope factor, if we all work hard at it in the SME sector, I think the big boys will take care of themselves. But I think we should have a fantastic future, and 3 years' time we'll say, what were we worried about? But it might take that long.
Well, I'm obviously a president of an organisation which is 80% women. So a lot of people ask, you know, how, you're a man, why are you looking after it and all the rest of it? It just happened to be my idea and I set it up, but, you know, obviously things are different now. Actually, John, you know, I don't really run it at all. June runs it, my other three quarters, as I call her. But looking at us here, we're all GOMs, I think they call them now, grey-haired old men. But Genesis as well has got a very strong group of women entrepreneurs, isn't it? It always has had. You still got that there?
Yeah, we have. As you know, we used to do with a predecessor organization, Small Business Bureau, Women in Business Awards every year,
Yes.
and Women in Business conferences and so on and so forth. Yes, we still have that. We have a couple of directors who are in business in their own right that wanted to resurrect a separate organization to some extent, because they were concerned particularly about the financing of women-owned businesses, that some are very good at it, but generally, you know, when a lady walks through the door with a particular business, the bank often, you know, thinks, oh dear, not another one, you know, we're not going to back this. So there's a prejudice still, our women in business think, against women progressing. And so we've set this up. They have been particularly looking at the money side of life to try and find ways of ensuring that women in business get financed fairly. And of course, other issues will emanate from that. But yet it's up and running. Karen Feingold, who I think you know, Garry,
Yeah.
is a director heading all that up. So we're waiting for great things there, aren't we, David?
We certainly are. But you've probably seen the research that if a woman comes and asks for money, they're only about half as likely to get it from a conventional bank as a man. There are all sorts of theories about that. One is that a woman tends to look and say, you know I've got those competencies, I haven't done those. Whereas we chaps bluster and say sometimes that we've got skills we haven't necessarily got. But
Really?
It's not,
wow.
Yeah. But it's not great, is it? When in fact, on the whole, in the first 5 years, a woman has got only a 5 or 6% chance, better chance of getting an SME through that initial period than a man has. The stats are a bit more varied, you know, the older you get. So there's all that talent out there, which isn't always, best put to creating new jobs.
I also think, there's some research done about bad debts amongst women entrepreneurs, and it is a lot lower than men. You know, they don't go bust that easily. You're more likely to get your money back if you lend it to a woman.
That's interesting. Well, we're coming towards the end of our sort of hour now. I mean, is there anything you gents would like to finish on? Is there anything that will sell your product to my collected masses out there?
Well, I think, Garry, what I'd like to do, I'd like them to tell us what their clients really need. They probably get fed up of organizations asking them that, but, you know, through you, filter them properly, and then, you know, we can take the things up, because, you know, it's important that the grassroots businesses tell people like us what really is going on. I mean, my mailbag most days are full of people where now the banks turn them down even on these current offers, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, which is crazy. But we need to know from the grassroots, from your members, clients, what their real problems are, and early enough so that we can, you know, maybe do something about it. So that's what I'd ask. David, you got anything else?
I'd add to that when we set up Genesis, it's because we knew that there is no such thing as the small business sector. There are lots of different sectors with different problems. And sometimes you find they've got the same problem. So I remember seeing the Federation of Master Bakers sitting down with one of the industries representing the horse sector, and they suddenly found they were both importing and exporting out of Hungary, and they have the same problems. But often government and others can divide and rule because the problems are different. And so the more deep data, the more we can get really detailed feedback from members such as yours who know their clients and know what their problems are, it gives us a great deal of leverage, and we hope we can develop that with you.
I think the other point on that is that if it can be regionalized as well, not just the problem itself, but, you know, in a region, this is a common problem. that's a lot easier for us to do something about. Because now, if nothing else, the current government have a lot of MPs all over the country. And so we might be able to well influence things a bit more locally.
Yeah, I think that's useful. I mean, for our part, you know, we'd like to see the government mandate that every small business should have a bookkeeper before it's allowed to practice, because I think that, I mean, that's never obviously going to happen. But I mean, the thing is, our members tend to have businesses which survive a little bit longer because they're businesses that have realized that the books take a bit of understanding and they're not just going to try and do it themselves. And I think the person that is an entrepreneur who wants to run a business, or in many cases has to run a business because they've lost a job or they've had children or whatever it might be. And I've said so many times recently on these programs that we've been running, the only people I know who have ever gone into business to look after the books is either a bookkeeper or an accountant. Everybody else, the books is just that nasty stuff that they have to do at the end of the month or something or other. And, you know, so I think that's great. But there is a lot of money. One of the things,
it occurs to me, of course, that, you know, with our Genesis business card, sort of credit card, is that, you know, your members, because they are doing the books of their clients, they might more easily qualify for these loans because they are having their books done by competent people.
It certainly works with lending, you know, that if somebody's got a decent cash flow proposal, well, as we know from the last seminar that I went to in the House of Lords that Genesis ran, I remember that was when Brian Binley was there and he was promoting it, talking about not access to funding. And the NACFAB, were there, National Association of Commercial Finance Brokers, they were saying that they, not because I was there, because I was late arriving and I was sitting at the back somewhere, but they were saying that if they can get a set of books off a bookkeeper, they know they're slightly more held in realism than if they get it from a firm of accountants or even the proprietor themselves, because they'd always look on the bright side, whereas bookkeepers are very realistic about what goes on. And they can answer questions like, well, you know, how often do you get paid? Oh, well, we get paid quite regularly. We don't have many debts. That doesn't help with banking. Bankers have got a bit of a problem trying to sort out the good from the bad. So,
yeah.
But there's an email going around at the moment and a Facebook post, I don't know if you've seen it, which says at the moment that if we carry on as we are, the government will have paid out 90 billion in furlough payments.
Oh, yeah.
But actually, they're paying 106 for HS2. They're paid 500 to go out the banks, 500 billion. So we think we can probably get through this. And I think that most of the people that I speak to are still trying at this moment to be very positive. The only problem is, just to paraphrase, to say something which was said by one of our politicians, a certain Mrs. Margaret Thatcher, who said, the government doesn't have any money.
Exactly right.
True, it's ours. They take it from us and then give it back to those of us who they think deserve it. So if they're going to pay out a lot of money, they've got to take it from somewhere. So, you know, it's not all held in some Swiss bank somewhere and they open the door occasionally. You know, it's all got to come into the front door before it goes out.
The trouble is it's owed to a lot of foreign people.
Yeah.
Foreigners.
I take a very long view, Gary. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars, we owed such a massive amount of debt that you know, it was nothing compared to today. You know, what today was very small, and we did pretty well at that point. At the end of the First World War, we turned it round. These are things that happen every 40 or 50 years, and it will be tough for a year or two for people who didn't deserve it.
But I mean, we're on about 80% GDP in national debt. We're going to be 120%, but I think Japan at the moment is like 270%.
Yeah.
The thing about national debt is it never gets paid back if you're a big economy.
No, and I think the thing that's coming from our members is that although some of them have worked with restaurants and pubs that are having trouble and nightclubs and various other things, it's surprising the entrepreneurial spirit will out. Yeah. And I know, you know, I'm getting a delivery every week for a company that makes up food, you know, and they've always done catering for events and everything. That's gone completely out of the water. So they sat around and said, well, now what we can do? So they have to deliver it now rather than to one place. They deliver it to several hundred. But every Wednesday, they spend an entire day taking out food to people, you know, for to have special meals. So I think we'll make something out of this. You know, I am the eternal optimist, I have to say, on this sort of thing. But so, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us.
There's a final point. I think it makes it very interesting. Your bookkeepers can make it so much easier to get money for their clients by keeping good books. That's the future.
And there's research evidence behind that.
I like that. Yeah, I mean, I think bookkeepers have really come into their own at the moment. You know, it's you know, out of every cloud comes a silver lining, and I think from the big majority of our members, that is the case. They've got an even bigger job as we run out of furlough or whatever else happens. But yeah, they're all really, really positive, and they'll be very pleased to have heard some of the things you've had to say today. And I look forward to discussing ways that we can work with Genesis to get a bit more out of the corridors of power, or the Zoom meetings of power, as they now are. But anyway, we'll see what we do. So thank you very much,
thank you,
and
thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, Garry.
Tomorrow for Furlough, it's Friday.
See ya. God bless you.
Thank you, Garry. Bye for now. Bye, everyone.